history students. Today we're talking about a fast-paced economic system called mercantilism. Hey, forget about free exchanges on the stock market, forget about the invisible hand, forget about competitive marketplaces. Today we're talking about mercantilism, and mercantilism is really different. It's basically a global struggle by nations to see who can get the most amount of wealth and use that wealth to conquer and even get more wealth. It was the economics of the age of absolutism, and it was basically a zero-sum game. What does that mean? Basically, if France succeeds, England has to lose. In this system, nations competed against each other to see who could get the most resources and become the most dominant power in the world. So how did this all work? Okay, so what exactly did mercantilism do? Well, the idea of mercantilism was developed by a French economic minister named Jean-Baptiste Colbert. And the way he described it was like this. First of all, you have to think of nations. Nations competing against each other. Well, what are they competing over? They're competing over colonies and to get raw resources. When they got those raw resources, which tended to be things like timber or cotton or sugar, they didn't just sit on those raw resources. They used them to make finished goods. And when you make a finished good, you're going to sell them to other countries, right? Well, what do you do with all the wealth or the bullion that you get from the other countries? You invest it back into your military. So your military can go out and get more colonies for more raw resources, and yeah, you get the idea. It's almost like a circle that keeps repeating itself. But we got to remember this, in the end, when you make those finished goods, you want to trade those goods. You want to sell them to somebody. Who are you selling them to? Your opponents, another country. But you got to make sure that you do more exports than you do imports. Why is that the case? Well, an export is basically when you sell something to another country, right? Well, if you're selling to another country, you're selling them your good and you're getting their wealth in return. That allows you to invest in your military. But what if you do the flip? What if you decide to import or buy from another country? That means you're sending your wealth to that country, they're going to invest in their military, and they're going to come out and conquer you. So the idea was to create what was called a favorable balance of trade. Or the idea being that you would have more exports than you're going to have imports. Okay, so what was the big effect of this? We got to remember at this time period, countries were going out and getting colonies. We kind of know about this, right? England went out and get colonies like the east coast of North America or like India. France got colonies in Canada, or what at the time was called the Louisiana Territories. Now, when they got those colonies, they would get raw resources. And then they would put restrictions on their colonies and say you can only trade with the mother country. Because if you trade with those other guys, they're going to invest in their military and come and conquer you. And because of that, we wanted to make sure that there was trade only within the empire. Here's a good example. Oliver Cromwell, you might remember the English guy who took over, who was a Puritan, he established what were called the Navigation Acts, saying that Americans could only trade with England. We kind of know what the result of that was, right? The American Revolution. Okay, so what were the big impacts of this economic system? Well, for one, it was expansion of empire, and that actually was a good thing for a lot of people. The wealth of the time grew, consumerism grew, there was a new middle class. At the same time, if you invest in militaries, you know what you're going to get, a lot of wars. And that's what happened. In the 1700s, there were tons of wars. One of the ones that I find the funniest was something called the War of Jenkins' Ear, where a British naval officer had his ear cut off by the Spanish. Now, that sounds kind of silly that people would go to war over that, but that's not what they were going to war over. They were going to war over the underlying causes, the fight over territories in the Caribbean. But here's the biggest consequence of them all, the African slave trade. If you wanted to produce all this wealth at the cheapest cost, what was the best way to do that? Well, Europeans came up with a system of having slaves from Africa. And those slaves were transferred over the Triangle Trade, which included 3 different continents. It included Europe, included Africa, and included the Caribbean. In the middle of all that, what was called the Middle Passage, a brutal passage of Africans being transported from Western Africa over to the Caribbean, where they eventually did hard labor in order to grow especially sugarcane, which was a labor-intensive crop. So what are our big takeaways that we take away from this? Takeaway number 1, remember that mercantilism was an economic system of competition between nation states during the age of absolutism. Takeaway number 2, remember that under mercantilism, nations wanted to create a favorable balance of trade, get more wealth to invest in their militaries to go get more raw resources for finished goods. And the last one we got to remember is that because of this, we ended up with wars, revolutions, and of course, the tragedy of the African slave trade. See you in class.